welcome to the woods, and welcome to the first of this series of DVDs that are going to tell you all about bushcraft and how to enjoy the natural world around us. We're going to start with a fascinating subject. Perhaps at the heart of the bushcraft syllabus and the great outdoors is the study and subject of fire. Now, whichever way you look at it, when one of our ancestors conjured fire for the first time, it was an extraordinary moment in our history. On this day, I reckon, the world changed forever. Relatively quickly, with all the different applications of fire, it led to the modern civilized world we live in today, and so much of it we take for granted. How we get to school or work, using a petrol engine. When we go home, switching on our electric heat, our electric lights. So many different applications now, and we forget that it all started with somebody 100,000 years ago or so, experimenting with fire by friction. We'll come on to that later, as we can also discover the many different applications and methods of fire lighting. But let's just dwell on what our lives would be like if we'd never discovered this technology. We can do that by considering all the different uses that we've put fire to over the years. Now, in the old days, when the sun went down, the people would gather around the fire. Not like these days. When the sun goes down, we might go home and switch on our electric heat or switch on our electric light. In the old days, people, when the sun went down and it got dark and it got cold, they'd gather around the fire. So warmth and light were two of the first uses of fire. They also learned that food could taste better or be purified by cooking. They also realized they could hunt animals by setting light into the bush, to the woods, to the area of ground to drive the animals out. Soon enough, it all led to the development of the Iron Age technology. And where would we be without all the tools, or the weapons, and all the uses we put the different metals to? The list is exhaustive. Even flavouring foods. Think about disposal, the generation of power, pottery. The list is endless, and perhaps you can have some fun by creating your own list. Let me challenge you and see if you can get to 40 different uses of fire. But the purpose of this DVD is to show you some very good ways that you can create fire safely in the outdoors. And let's face it, there is nothing finer than sitting by a fire in a beautiful part of the British countryside, either to have a cup of tea or just for some company on the trail. And if we learn how to rely much more on the natural world around us and less upon what we carry with us, it's a much more wholesome and satisfying experience. So the skills that I'm going to show you are the sort of skills that with a little practice you can learn very easily and apply to every visit into the British countryside. For now though, let's start somewhere near the beginning and introduce the subject of firecraft using limited materials. It would perhaps be too much too soon to take away everything that we're familiar with, so let's start with the basics. Let's start with a familiar match and a bit of paper. But even in the rain, that, as I've seen many, many times, represents too much of a challenge for most people. So watch carefully and you'll be able to light a fire even in the rain using the minimal amount of resources. So I'm looking for a place where we can practice our skills of firecraft. And it's important to say at this point that it's not generally permissible to light a fire anywhere in the British countryside. You'll need permission from landowners. Often, landowners are very happy, as long as you're tidy and manage a small fire well, to give that permission. But always remember that it's not okay just to light fires anywhere, particularly on public land. The other thing to consider is whereabouts on the ground you might light a fire. For example, down here at my feet, there are bluebells about to come out. I don't want to damage those bluebells. It's not a good place for the fire, so I'll look for a patch of bare ground. At times when bare ground is in short supply, for example, perhaps there's some grass, you might consider digging the turf so that you can replace the turf afterwards. And when that's carefully managed, you'll find that the grass will carry on growing perfectly as before. But for our purposes today, let's look for a good patch of bare ground. So here we are. We're in an open bit of woodland, and there's nothing to damage. There's no plants on the ground, there's no nearby trees, no overhanging branches. Now, what I'd always do nevertheless is clear a space for the fire. For two reasons. One, to give me a nice clear flat surface to work on, and two, so that we can cover our track, cover our trail. It's not that we've done anything wrong and we need to cover ourselves for that purpose. It's more for the sake of neatness and tidiness and leaving the wood as we find it. And that's very important to us in practicing bushcraft. Now, depending on the size of the fire will depend on how much ground you need to clear. For today's purposes, I'm just making a small fire that would perhaps boil a little bit of water for a pot of tea. So what I'm looking for first is some sticks that I can create a platform with. Now, a platform for fire making can be very, very important and critical even in very wet conditions. The platform does two things. It lifts the fire off damp ground and also allows air to circulate underneath. Air, which we'll see later, is a very important component in our fire making. Now, I can find the sticks from the ground or the dead wood that's still standing on a tree. But critically, I want these platform sticks to be straight. So that's what I'm going to go and look for now. It's too bent. It's too knobbly. It won't do. Be discerning. Okay, here we go. That's what we're looking for. And then probably do something with that. Good, so we've gathered our materials for our platform, so we can stash those while we look now for some kindling. This sort of area here, a place where there's a variety of different trees, will yield lots of decent standing deadwood sticks. Now, it takes a little while to get your eye in to see what the trees are providing. It may be a visit to 2 or 3 trees is enough. It may be that you need to visit 20 or even 25 different trees to select very carefully your materials to start your fire. So what we're looking for is those sticks that are still on the tree. They're not on the ground. If I were to pick the kind of kindling that's lying here on the woodland floor, we might be unsure how long they've been lying here, absorbing all the moisture from the ground. Consequently, to ensure that we can get and guarantee our fire to start, we want to pick them off the ground, on the trees themselves. That way, if they're wet, if it's been raining, or even if it's still raining, we'll know that the moisture on those sticks is just surface moisture, and with a little bit of heat, it'll evaporate away. If we pick them from the ground, it'll make our fire making that much more difficult. Now, on a summer's day, that's not so critical. In a dry period, it won't matter so much. But if it's been damp, or indeed, if it's pouring with rain, the best practice is to visit the trees and select very carefully. Now what I'm looking for are those matchstick thin, dead sticks that you find on hazel trees, on willow trees, on a number of different tree species. And I'm going to be quite fussy. It would normally take me around about 10 minutes to gather what I need to start the fire. To an unpracticed eye, it may take 15 or 20 minutes, but you'll soon get to know the trees. So, this is a hazel tree, and a hazel tree will offer us lots of dead sticks, but be careful, a thin stick shooting up from the tree might be living. Let me show you the difference. Up here, it'll snap. Nice and thin, that's what we're looking for our fire. But here's another shoot, for example, that will only bend. And that's an easy way to tell the difference. When it's bending like that, it means it's still living. And apart from damaging the tree, of course, it's useless for our fire making. So this is what we're after, these nice thin shoots. And often on one tree, you'll get quite a few. Now I'm showing you nice thin sticks because I want you to understand that if you can get them matchstick thin, then it doesn't matter. As long as you have a brief initial bit of heat, like a piece of paper, even if it's raining, this method of fire making will always work. So now we're in front of some willow, and willow is also very productive in terms of our matchstick thin pieces of stick. Again, notice the difference. Where it's green, it will bend. Where it's dead, it will snap. Now I'm keeping them long. You may notice a good decent length means that we can manage the fire without burning our fingers, as you'll see later. Okay. So, the kind of stack of kindling that you'll pick and choose and select very carefully will amount to something like that. So we're ready to build a fire. First of all, remember our platform. Sticks that I've gathered, not necessarily on or off the ground, just straight sticks as long as they're straight and the right sort of size for the size fire that you're building. Now look, when I lay these straight sticks out, they'll pack tightly together. Now that's a detail. It's a detail for a wet and rainy day. In the dry summer, it doesn't matter if they're a little bit loose, or a little bit twisted, or a little bit knobbly. Not so much. But on a wet day or in difficult conditions, the straightness might be the critical difference between success and failure. When these sticks are packed tightly together, none of the embers will fall down onto the damp ground. So that's an attention to detail to remember in difficult firelighting conditions. So there's our platform. Now most of the time, creating the platform for the fire to go on will be made of dead sticks. The dead sticks will contribute to the fire itself. It could be that they were green, that they still had sap and moisture, and it wouldn't matter so much. It would still be important to get it off the damp ground and allow air to flow underneath. So then, I've sorted out my bundles of sticks into different sizes. Here are my first two sizes, long, straight and thin. You'll notice how long they are, and as you'll see later, that becomes critical when the fire is flashing up and you want to maneuver the kindling and control where the flame is and where the heat is. If I broke all these up into small pieces, all I could do is throw speculative pieces onto the fire and I'd lose control. So those are my starting bundles. And then I've gathered a couple more to feed into the fire once it's going. Next size up. And the next size up. And so on. If I was building a big fire, I'd have everything stacked and neat. Remember, it's all about preparation. As they say in bushcraft, there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad preparation.
Cool.
So this would be a starting position, if you like. The ground swept back, the platform laid, and our materials to hand. Everything within reach. I don't need to go off and gather and forage quickly to manage the situation. Now, as I said before, we're not asking you to jump into the deep end of fire making to begin with. So with a minimal amount of resources, we can still learn something about firecraft. So using familiar items, for example, a sheet of paper. There are many mistakes we could make that would make the difference in our fire making. And one of those mistakes we might make is with a sheet of newspaper, which will give us a certain amount of heat, is to fold it. And I've seen this done countless times. And if we fold it, what we're depriving the fire of is essential oxygen. And paper that is folded becomes too airtight and the fire gets into difficulty. Likewise, people that twist the paper will also deprive the fire of vital oxygen. Many people will also think, well, with a limited amount of materials, they would also need to conserve some of those materials. And so they might tear it in half and save some for later. In actual fact, when we've got such a minimal amount of materials, we need all of the heat in one place at one time. So keep the piece of paper together. What I suggest you do with it is to scrunch it into a ball. Not too tight, but enough so that it's compact and in one place. If the paper is too spread out, then the heat is too spread out. So bring it together in a scrunch. So our favoured method of ignition is using the very familiar box of matches. But let's pause here for a moment. We might consider a few aspects to match lighting that again could make a critical difference. First of all, we like to use friction matches. There are some skills and knowledge that we need, even in simple match striking, that can make a difference between success and failure. For one thing, we're going to use friction matches. And these are the types of matches that you can light on a rough surface anywhere, and that are not dependent upon the matchbox itself. After all, in wet conditions in Britain, it can be the matchbox that suffers dampness and becomes useless to the match striking. We don't use safety matches for that reason, useless without the box. But one of these, you'll be able to strike on any rough surface. Like a stone. Now, how many times have I seen everything gathered very well and all the preparation done for the match striking to let the fire down? How many times have I seen endless matches being struck because nobody's considered the skill, the dexterity that's required to preserve matches, preserve your resources and make sure that you get the match strike right first time. So let me show you a few ways that you might make a mistake. So when you strike a match this way, as most people do. What often happens is that. And striking a short little match like this is, to say the least, somewhat hazardous. We also see matches struck and then held up like this. As you can see, it's not so successful. Fire needs food, and as it rises, there's no food at the top of the match. Likewise, if we were to hold it down at the bottom, it might have plenty of food, but that would be rather hazardous for our fingers. So we're going to hold the match at a certain angle, like this, to ensure a long life for the flame. But we also need to protect it from the breeze. So you may also have seen this, an old scouting trick that opens the box like this and uses the cavity here to keep the match protected from the breeze. Now, it's very effective, but it is a bit hazardous. After all, these matches are very flammable, and it also can destroy your box over a number of uses. So we prefer that you practice sheltering the flame with your hands. So another very common mistake is to drop the matchbox as you protect the flame, like this. Needless to say, whereas the flame might be protected from the breeze, the matchbox is not protected from the ground. A few times on damp ground and you will lose the effectiveness of the matchbox. Better then to hold our matches and matchbox in our hands by holding it like this. The next thing is, in order not to break the match, we're going to strike downwards using the strength of the grain in the piece of wood here, in this little match, which we've seen is very vulnerable to be broken like this. But if you try to break the match by pressing down this way, it's very tough. So we'll use the strength of the grain as we strike down like this. Now look, my fingers are quite close to the match head, just for initial contact to make sure there's good friction, especially if it's an older matchbox and when this has grown quite worn and quite smooth. So to increase the friction, we bring a finger in, or two, and then straight away, as it ignites, we lift them off. Now, in one movement, we'll bring it round so that our hands are now cupped around the flame. A little bit of finger yoga, and it may take a little practice, but it's a very, very effective way then, once we've got the flame alight, the matchbox in our hand, to protect against the breeze. Now, I've turned quite deliberately with my fire into the wind to face this gentle breeze. So then I can hold my hands up and we'll be able to see the flame alight against the breeze. And there she is. So, without any fuss, without any trouble, with everything gathered, we can place it straight on the source of heat. And because we've gathered them so long, we can manipulate and control where the heat is going. That can be critical on a very wet day. 2 stacks makes sure that there's enough fuel to feed the fire. They're thin enough, even if there's moisture here, even if it's been raining, it'll all evaporate in this initial heat. Now, if it's pouring with rain, we know this is going to work, and I might have to use my body like this to shield the paper as I bring it out of a pocket and to shield the match striking from falling rain. But with practice, this is a method that will get the fire going in even the most hostile conditions. Now that it's beginning to take, I can turn to my next set and begin one by one. Again, because they're long and straight, I can place them exactly where I need them. If I were to break them, as many people do, into small pieces, now that this is so hot, if I try and place it, then I'll damage my fingers, and I'm resorting now to having to throw them on. So keep them nice and long so that you can place them on. The fire likes to have a thermal column, all the heat and energy in one place, and so that's where I'm placing my sticks very carefully to build the fire. So, now the fire is lit, it's time to enjoy it. And what better way than toasting a marshmallow? Now, you may not consider these wild food, of course. They're one of the modern luxuries, one of the things that we can enjoy and bring to the campfire. But I'm particularly pleased that these days there is even an organic marshmallow that you can get from shops and whole food suppliers. And in my view, they taste even better. So hold the marshmallow somewhere over the embers, but not the flame. The flame will blacken them, and all you'll taste is carbon, like burnt toast. Remember too, that as it gets hot, it can burn as it drips or falls off the stick. Patience is a virtue. All good things come to those that wait. So rather than plunging it straight into the middle of the heat, just toast it gently on the outside. And there, you just see it beginning to bubble and brown. Now, rather than throwing it straight into your mouth, just leave it to cool down, just for half a minute or so. And then when you're ready, and you really can't wait any longer, pop it in your mouth. And that, sitting by your fire, in a beautiful natural place, is as good as it gets. So once our fire has served its purpose, it's time to dispose of it. There's nothing that offends me more when I walk out in the countryside to see leftover fireplaces. And the worst of it, of course, is with tin foil or tin cans lying around and people not bothered to clear away after themselves when it's so easy. Now this fire is still warm, and we will have to pour water on it to get it cool and then attend to disposing of it. Our aim is always to leave no trace. So with some water, we'll make sure that the fire is thoroughly out. It would be tempting at this stage, once the fire is out, is perhaps to kick it apart. But in my experience, that makes a mess. So, we get our hands dirty. And once we're sure that it's cold, then we pick up those embers and we scatter them. All different directions, scooping it up from the ground, making sure that every bit of charcoal has gone. And when the ground is bare once again, we'll cover it. All those materials that we swept to one side can now be swept back over, and we leave the wood just as we found it. Nobody would ever know. So here's an array of common tinders that are easily sourced, easily harvested all over the country. We have perhaps one of the most recognisable forms of tinder now is birch bark. Birch bark that peels off the tree without harming the tree. Please don't cut it from the tree because that will expose the tree to infection and disease. Fallen birch limbs, of course, can be cut and scraped. We've got bracken that we've seen. This is the inside of what's called a cat-tail or reed mace. Now, if you think of the plant bulrush, it's probably what I'm talking about. It's easily misnamed. It's the plant that grows by the ponds, the edges of rivers and lakes, with that bullet brown seed head, which contains this lovely flammable material. Here we've got some honeysuckle. Again, a climber that peels naturally, sheds its bark and can be easily stripped. Likewise, clematis, another climber that sheds its bark. Many of the things, in fact, that the birds are collecting for their nests are often good sources of tinder. And over here we've got a King Alfred's cake, or a cramp ball, which is a fungus that grows on dead or dying ash trees, and as we'll see later, is very useful to know about. There are many more tinders round and about the British countryside, and I encourage you to try as many as you can to see what works best. So just to show you the distinction of tinder, if I bring a little of the reed mace seed head, you'll see that instantly it will catch a spark. One has to be careful not to suffocate the flame. So don't pack the tinder too tight together. It can be used sparingly and teased apart like this. So earlier on, we looked at the applications of fire. We've used already two methods of making fire, but in total, in terms of methods of fire lighting, we can divide it neatly into 6 categories. Now, first of all, we used a match. Now, what category should that be in? You might say friction. In fact, I would suggest it's chemical. Here, we can see them easily distinguished. Here is our spark. Here is friction. Here is the chemical. Here is the sun. Electrical and compression. Let's look at them all, one by one. So let's go through our methods one by one. Perhaps the easiest place to start is with the sun itself. And as long as there's sunshine, and you've got one of these, then as long as things are dry and it's warm enough, you'll get fire very, very easily. Watch. I place the magnifying glass over the tinder and bring the sunspot in as close as I can. And when it's in its smallest, brightest little concentration of light, that's when it'll start smoking. And we'll use 2 chemicals for this experiment. We'll use potassium permanganate and we'll use glycerin. We'll also use a piece of paper for dramatic effect. Now, first of all, the potassium permanganate. And then the glycerin. This becomes very volatile when the two chemicals are compressed together. And stand back. So this is a fire piston. It's been purposefully made to capture fire, and when this piston is driven down at speed into the chamber, whatever is inside becomes very hot, very flammable. So I have a little piece of char cloth inside, ready to ignite.
Just get close. There we go.
Next in our methods of fire lighting, we'll come to the electric method. And here I'm using a battery, and I need something to conduct the power stored, the energy inside that battery. And I'm going to use some wire wool. So the battery has the stored electricity, the wire will conduct the electricity from the battery. Very quickly that becomes roasting hot. Dropped into a ball of tinder, you'll soon have fire. Here in my little tinder box, I have a piece of old tool steel bent over and a bit of flint. Now, it's a relatively straightforward to create a few sparks in this way, but as you can see, there aren't many and you have to work quite hard for them. What they used to do in the old days is they'd carry something like a bit of char cloth. Char cloth is made using a tin like this, or an old biscuit tin with a hole in the middle, throw it in the fire. A piece of cloth like cotton or silk is even better. Even cut up an old pair of jeans and put them in, and when it's all smoking away, probably about 15 minutes in the fire, something like that, then you open it up and it's all charred and it catches a spark very, very well. The difficulty with this older technology is catching it quickly. In the old days, they did nothing quickly. You can see that now it's just beginning to burn through very, very easily, even from a small little spark. So the last method is perhaps the most fascinating of all. It's thought that our ancestors would have generated fire for the first time by rubbing sticks together, this fire by friction. Now, I've learnt many years ago, and I learnt under instruction, with guidance, with information, with knowledge. Let's consider our ancestors, trial and error, and they found their way to this most remarkable method. In principle, it's 2 sticks, 2 bits of dry wood, preferably cut off a standing tree. As a rule of thumb, we would use soft hardwoods or hard softwoods. But one of the best places to start is by using sycamore. It's not that it's so easy. It's a kind of mid-range wood where we perfect our technique so that we can adapt it to using a different variety of woods. And we would cut a thicker piece and use a thinner piece for the drill. And we would turn these into these 2 pieces, cut with a knife or an axe the hearth and the drill. And the principle is that the drill spins with speed and pressure into the hearth, and dust is created. A notch is cut. The dust falls into the notch, heats up. When it gets to a critical temperature, it begins to coalesce together into an ember. So let's take it through step by step. First of all, the drill. It needs to be a maximum diameter of about 1 inch, and preferably about 3/4 of an inch. The thinner it gets, the more return you get for all your effort. But too thin, of course, and it becomes fragile, and you'll also get a smaller ember. If you were using a wood like sycamore or willow, and you had the choice to cut it with a natural diameter, it would save you time. Otherwise, you would pare this down to reach these dimensions. It takes longer. Now the hearth is relatively easy to make. With an axe or with a knife, it can be split down and created very quickly. It wants to sit flat on the ground, and it doesn't want to be more than 1 inch at most in thickness. The next piece of equipment we're going to look for is the bearing block. And the bearing block is a piece of wood that's very hard, that will hold the drill in place while it's spinning. It's critical that the bearing block is harder than the drill, made of a harder wood like oak or even ash. In this case, it's a bit of boxwood, because at the top you don't want any friction at all. You want it to run smooth. Lastly, a little piece of bark to catch our ember. Then, of course, we'll need the bow. This whole system is called the bow drill, and the bow looks like this. Now it's been cut. It wants to be rigid and inflexible, and the dimensions are an arm's length. These days we have the luxury of using a fine paracord, a very, very strong cord. In the old days, of course, it would have been something like rawhide prepared or pounded sinew. Prepared, pounded and twisted into a strong cord. So our materials are ready. We've got a hearth cut, the drill, the bearing block, and of course the bow. These are the basics. Now we'll set to work. First of all, we need to notch to cut the right shape into the hearth. Now for accuracy, we'll measure about 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, then the edge which is closest to me as our middle point. There, using a knife, we can twist the notch with our knife like this, just to begin it. But after that, after we've got an initial start, then we need to do the process which is known as burning in. If we shortcut that process and try and do it all with a knife, it won't work. There are too many variables in this system, and everything has to be done quite precisely to ensure success. Now, the burning in process uses the same action as for when we generate fire. We take the bow, we put it underneath our arm. We then, using the bottom of the drill here, come underneath the string, pointing it to the middle, like so. We're then going to twist this so that the bottom of the drill comes over the top of the string and points down, like so. And you'll notice how tight that was. And it wants to be tight, for if there is any slippage here and the string slips on the wood, it's like a leak of energy. And we'll need to stop and retie the bowstring. Then we'll place the bottom of the drill into the notch that's already prepared. And then taking our bearing block, we'll fill it with a piece of holly, which is to grease the top. At the top here, we do not want any friction. So this is to grease the way and keep it spinning freely in the top. Now with a bearing block comfortable in the hand, the arm and the wrist are lodged tightly against the leg. There is no chance to hold it free because there's too much pressure on the drill and the hand will wobble. What we're aiming for is the drill to spin on its own axis without wobble. My posture is upright and I'm able, at the right point, to lean upon my hand with my weight and increase the pressure as I increase the speed. And it's a combination of speed and pressure that will produce the result. Initially, we're just looking to burn a circle into the hearth. Grabbing the string to tighten it on the drill, we get ourselves into a nice, smooth action to begin with. Now you'll see the bottom of my drill is entirely blackened by this process. You must pursue it until it is entirely black. Now if you try to shortcut it, and the hole in the hearth is not the diameter of this drill, again you'll get into problems and it'll get out of shape. So be rigorous, and when it's all black, then we can cut our notch. Now to cut our notch, we're going to trace 1/8 of this circle, a slice of this pie, about 1/8 by eye, into a V shape, going all the way to the edge of the hearth. Okay, make sure it goes to the middle and all the way to the edge. Now, very carefully, we'll cut the notch. Do be careful not to rush this part. It should only take 5 or 10 minutes. It wants to be nice and neat and to please our eye. Generally speaking, if it pleases the eye and it's nice and neat, it'll be just the right proportions and well prepared. The piece of wood that I'm using here is ivy. It's one of the easier and very common bits of wood. It was dead on the tree, and one of the ways that we can test whether it is in good condition for fire by friction is to press a thumbnail, and this applies to any wood that we might choose. And if we can press our thumb and make an imprint with our thumbnail into the wood like that, then it's in good condition. If it goes in too easily, then it's deteriorated too much. Similarly, if we cannot make hardly any impression at all, then it is not ready yet, is not seasoned enough. So the woods that you might look for to begin with, especially when you're beginning and learning, are sycamore and perhaps willow. Very plentiful around the British countryside, and definitely the best woods to learn on. And this notch is the channel in which the dust that is rubbed when the surface is rubbed together falls into. Now this time I place a piece of bark underneath the hearth, ready to catch the embers. Assuming I'm successful in generating an ember, At that point, I've got a limited amount of time to transfer the ember into a ball of tinder. So everything's set. I've prepared my tinder bundle, and you'll recognise some of those tinders inside. The King Alfred's cake, the birch bark, the bracken, and lots of dried grass around it. And you can see it's a fair size, because when this starts flaming and it's within my hands, I don't want my hands to be burned. Press it down so it looks a little like a bird's nest. And just have it ready to stand by. Then, pick up your bow, fit in the drill, pointing the bottom end down. You'll notice the drill is also on the outside of the rope. It's not that it wouldn't work on the inside, but it gives you more string. And you'll notice in my bowing action that I'm using all of the string on the bow and not just using short backwards and forwards thrusts with my arm. And that's another factor that you must consider. The other thing to notice is that my bow is parallel to the ground as it's soaring back and forwards. This is important. You'll find when you begin that the string will rise up and down the drill and even fly off at one end or the other, and that's because your bowing action is doing this with the movement of your arm, so compensate. Squeeze the string to keep that string tight. Keep upright and swing the arm from the shoulder and allow yourself that rhythm to begin with before you speed up and apply the pressure. When the smoke starts getting yellow and thick, it usually means that it's begun to sustain itself as a small little ember. Now watch carefully. I must very carefully take the hearth away from the ember without pulling it over, because it gets stuck in this notch. Once that's safely away, I've got more time than you might think. But I want to get this ember off the damp corridor of air that's down here, especially during the autumn or winter months, or when it's wet. And now, as a good strong ember, I'm ready to drop it into my ball of tinder. But be very careful. I've seen plenty of fires lost at this point. You've done all the work to get this going, and then if you're careless, you can lose it. So very carefully, I take care of it as I put it inside the tinder bundle. I then stand up and feed it the food that it wants. Tighter than you'd think, and keep the air going. I swing it to keep the air going, I take a breath. This is why you need lots of padding around, so that you can hold it.